Toronto, an awesome, safe place to live and play in. But there's a darkness in all cities, and Toronto is no exception. If you cruise down Broadview Avenue, you pass a large, beautiful Italianate building. During the day, it is an unassuming space that looks like government buildings. At night, however, the facade becomes austere, and it is then that one will understand the darkness of the old Don jail. Once upon a time, this prison was called the Palace for Prisoners, a place that represented a new era in the public attitude towards the treatment of criminals. Before this palace would be constructed, jail conditions in Toronto were just as horrid as any other. So how did an institution aiming to be a progressive reform to inhumane practices turn into the very place that housed those inhumane practices? The Don Jail housed prisoners from 1864 until 1977, over 100 years of horrid conditions. Cells were 3 by 8 feet and lacked plumbing and electricity. Prisoners were not allowed to speak without permission, received only monthly visits from outsiders, and were flogged when they committed any prison violations. Only an hour was actually spent outside of the overbearing building, and that entire hour was spent walking, as they were never allowed to sit and enjoy the outdoors. Hangings would take place until the death penalty was abolished in Canada in 1976, and from 1908 to 1962 alone, there were 34 hangings at the jail. And with traumatic deaths come traumatic hauntings. Many ghosts are said to inhabit the Don jail. One is a woman, long blonde hair, who was kept in one of the tiny cells reserved for women. It was in the 1890s that she hung herself with her own bed sheets. She has appeared to guards in the main rotunda area as a very angry ghost in white. It was a typical horrid day for the prisoners when one inmate had an experience. Around 2 a.m, he hailed a guard and claimed that a punching bag used by the inmates had moved, as he heard the chains rattle as though someone punched it. The guard checked, made sure all inmates were in their cells and that the area was empty of living souls. The inmate cried out again for the guard, claimed it happened again, but gave up when the guard did nothing. Soon, 2 more inmates began to complain about the terrifying noise. The guards did a search, turned on all the lights, and did a full prisoner count, yet everyone was accounted for. Lights were turned off, and everyone went about sleeping again. But the chains rattled again. Someone was hitting the punching bag, and this time the guards heard it. They ran into the area to catch the culprit, but there was no one. Who had hit the bag? Why was it still swinging? I guess we'll never know. The spookiest happening, however, was in 2007 when the parking lot was being excavated. There, beneath their feet, were bodies. One was Frederick Davis, a skeleton with a gold tooth, and his story is perhaps the most chilling of all. It was 1920 when an 8-year-old boy named Philip Goldberg was found dying between 2 billboards south of High Park. Suffering from a severe head wound and a deep gash across his throat, his hands held grass and candy wrappers. The prime suspect was Davis, a neighbor of the boy. Davis was syphilitic, walked with a pronounced limp, was riddled with open sores, and was likely suffering from dementia as the advanced stage of his disease took over. When brought to trial, the jury found him guilty in just a minute. Despite being found mentally unsound by a doctor, he was nonetheless sentenced to death. After the hanging, a post-mortem examination would see the doctor dissecting the prisoner's brain to look for a reason for the crimes committed. But of all the bodies excavated that day in 2007, Davis's was the only one still possessing his brain.